Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on decarbonizing the transportation industry, focusing on light-duty vehicles. We have a terrific panel of experts who are going to be discussing this issue, and we'll also be very happy to be taking your questions, and I'll get to that in a minute. But thank you for taking the time to join us. We intend to really dive deeply into this critical part of the decarbonization and energy mix. Before we do that, let me just remind you that we'll be happy to take your questions toward the end of the hour. So please submit them in writing through the tab that's available to chat, and that we'll get to as many of your questions as we possibly can before the end of the hour. I'd also like to encourage all of you to look at the Our Energy Library, which is on the OEP website and has many materials that are relevant to today's discussion and which we encourage you to take advantage of as you do your work. I also want to, of course, thank our partners and supporters at OEP, without whom we could not be providing this program and all the different programs that OEP does provide. So our gratitude and appreciation to our wide range of partners who support our efforts. So let's get to the discussion without any further ado and jump in, because this is a critical issue, as everyone who is on knows. So I would ask all of our panelists to turn on their cameras, and I'll just let everybody know I'm actually filling in for our moderator, Eric Wood, who had a last-minute conflict arise. So I'm going to be talking with our panelists today as we get into this issue. Let me briefly and quickly introduce them. We have John Eichberger, who is the Executive Director of the Transportation Energy Institute. Before that, served for more than 14 years with NACS and has been for more than 25 years in this field, one of the leading, really national experts on the transportation energy market. So welcome, John. Thank you for joining us. We also have Raffi Freedman-Gurspan, who is the Deputy Director of Public Engagement at the United States Department of Transportation. So she is at DOT after having spent years in the nonprofit and government sectors, truly an expert on transportation and energy, and we're delighted to have you here. Thank you for joining us, Raffi. And Justine Johnson from the state of Michigan, the Chief Mobility Officer for the state of Michigan. She leads the state's Office of Future Mobility and Electrification. She works across partnerships with academia, with private industry, to really promote the startup and scale up of emerging mobility technologies and businesses. And so she will be filling us in on things that are going on in Michigan and all of the good work that her office is doing. So thank you for being here, Justine. So we're going to jump right in. And I think what I'd like to do is direct the first question to John to give us a little bit of an overview. John, when we think about the transportation component of our national, state, local decarbonization goals, how big a piece of the overall picture does that really constitute?
That's a huge piece. Depending on which year of data you look at, and data is always subjective depending on your selection, the EPA usually puts the transportation emissions component at 30 to 33% of our national total emissions of carbon. So when you're looking at decarbonization, it's critical. When you think about it also from a political viability perspective, constituents are very familiar with transportation, and it is a sector that resonates with them. So I think it is a critical element in our tool box to try to reduce carbon emissions across the board.
Thanks, John. I mean, it really illustrates, so often we sort of focus on the power generation piece and the electricity piece, but the transportation piece, as you said, is a major part of that puzzle, which is what we're now going to dive into. And Raffi, maybe I could start with you, because the Department of Transportation issued a U.S. national blueprint for transportation decarbonization earlier this year, and it really illustrated the whole of government approach to dealing with this challenge. Why is that the approach that the government is taking?
Well, thank you. First, I should really just thank you, Bill, and everyone here for the chance to speak with folks out there, not only just broadly on, transportation and this important conversation, but really, as you say, from a whole of a government approach. The federal government understands that if we're going to really tackle the threat of climate change and really looking at not just in silos, the different issues, but really from an intersectional standpoint, that we had to address this from a whole of government approach. And so that's why we authored alongside the Departments of Energy, Transportation, Housing, Urban Development, and the EPA, a memorandum of understanding to formalize our commitment to at the highest levels of collaboration and coordination. For that very reason, because we understood that if we were working in silos, we were not going to achieve the ultimate goal around decarbonization. And so we are looking forward to the continued work that we will be doing over the next few years with our department interagency partners. And we understand that, again, if we're going to tackle this issue, that we really need all the specialty approaches and all the interdisciplinary ways to address the issue. And so that's why I think this administration understood this was the smart way to go about the decarbonization issue.
Let me ask you a little bit more about the blueprint. How does it specifically look at the area of light duty vehicles and address that part of the picture?
Sorry. So in terms of light duty vehicles, I think folks know we're talking about cars, light duty pickup trucks and minivans, and most vehicles with tires. And we, again, we understand that these are the primary components that are sending emissions into the atmosphere from transportation. And so one of the things that we have made sure to do is really think about when it comes to the standards of industry-wide fleets that are out there. We're thinking about addressing the reduction. And one of the things that NHTSA, as folks know, just did is establish a final rule around corporate average fuel economy, and said those standards were set in 1975 to help reduce the rates of carbonization. And the final rule sets examples of approximately 49 mpg for regulated vehicles in model year 2026, and saving consumers about $14,000 in total fuel expenses over the lifetime of vehicles produced. And so, I think that's just one example of how we are trying to address this issue, and also really thinking about, in particular, the use of EVs over the next few years. As folks are aware, we have put out our national electric vehicle infrastructure charging formula funds to the states, as well as our community financing dollars, the CFI programs that are really helping, in particular, communities such as tribal communities, low-income communities, get the dollars that they need to help build up the infrastructure for electrification.
It's a great point about electric vehicles. And John, let me turn to you on this. With respect to electric vehicles, that seems to get a lot of the, if not the vast majority of attention when it comes to decarbonizing the transportation sector. Are there other alternative fuels as well that are part of this mix and that are important to bear in mind when we talk about decarbonizing light-duty vehicles?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons EVs get so much attention is policy has been driving that direction. And I mentioned before the political relevance to your constituencies. They see tailpipes. EVs don't have tailpipes. But I think we all understand that there's more to emissions than tailpipe. You have to look at life cycle emissions. We recently did a life cycle analysis where EVs are about 40% lower carbon emitting over their life cycle than a combustion engine vehicle, but that's still not 100%. So they're not zero. They are better in certain circumstances. But we have to address the fact there's about 300 million combustion vehicles in the United States today. And we did a back envelope calculation. Even if we were to mandate 100% ZEVs by 2035, at current sales and turnover rate, 40% of vehicles on the road in 2050 would still be combustion. So if we're really serious about mitigating carbon emissions, we need to support new developments like electric vehicles, fuel cell hydrogen vehicles, those new technologies. But we have to address the fuel of the existing legacy fleet. And I think we need to look at biofuels. We need to look at lower carbon alternatives. We need to look at it from a life cycle. There are things we can do from the farm where we're growing soybeans for diesel, for biodiesel, where we're growing corn for ethanol, to reduce carbon emissions from the farm all the way through the system. There's things we can do at the oil field and the oil refinery to reduce carbon emissions. We need to create a scenario where we're bringing lower carbon liquid fuels to market while we're supporting the development of alternative technologies in the vehicle, because only that way can we address carbon emissions from the 300 million on the road today, as well as bringing a new technology option for customers as we go forward. So there's a lot of things we can do now to have a meaningful impact. We did a study last year on decarbonizing combustion vehicles. One of the things we looked at was current technology, but also 10, 15, 20 years from now. What investments, what policies do we need to be thinking about now to enable innovation to bring brand new solutions to market? What about e-fuels, electric fuels? What about pyrolysis gasoline production? These are more expensive, less high yield technologies, but using the right inputs, they can deliver a zero emission, a zero carbon fuel that can go into existing vehicles. So we really need to be open to innovation to satisfy the demands of existing fleets, as well as bringing new technologies to market. And if the government and industry work together, man, there's so many things we can do. The power, what I find is amazing, what I find somewhat frustrating in some policy is some policies are being put forth at different jurisdictions saying this technology is the answer. We're going to electrify everything. Problem solved, climate change is over. That's not true. And we can't sell that. We have to make sure that we're building government industry partnerships to allow the really smart people out there. And there's a lot of smart people out there. I'm fortunate to be humbled to be around them sometimes, and I feel completely inadequate. But there are some brilliant people out there. If we give them the tools and the pathway, they can find answers we've never even thought about. And so I'm excited about what we have available to us coming forward. And I look forward to the government and industry working together to find those solutions that make most sense.
Well, I agree. I'm humbled to be around the three of you, honestly, given the expertise that you bring here. And that's why I really want to bring in Justine, because you all are doing some really cutting edge work in the state of Michigan. And maybe you could talk about the role of states and local governments, how that relates to the federal government's efforts, and some of the things you're doing in Michigan to push forward in this area.
Sure. Thank you again so much for having me here for this important conversation. One thing I always like to just ground folks is I work within the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification. And so that is a large title, and most people are like, well, what does that actually mean? And so usually I like to ground this conversation in what is mobility really, which is the movement of people, goods, and information across land, water, and air. So that's kind of how we think about that. And electrification, of course, anything that is propelling a vehicle, an aircraft, or a vessel in motion using electricity. So that's just kind of like where I like to always start this conversation. But the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification was established in 2019 through an executive directive by Governor Whitmer. And as part of this is really one being the understanding that the state of Michigan has a strong automotive heritage. And also we understand that mobility, this term, is ever encompassing everything, including auto and the future of mobility, which includes all things from micromobility to an autonomous vehicle, electric vehicles, and more, and really creating this office to be that one-stop shop for all things mobility within the state. We have something unique that I always like to talk about. In last October, we announced, in October 2022, we announced My Future Mobility Plan, which is the state's strategy for all things mobility and electrification. So it's an 11-point plan. And really, there are 3 core goals of that plan that really help us to guide the way in which we do our work and the way in which we think. And first and foremost, it's really about thinking about that transition and growth of the mobility industry and as well as the workforce. But also, a second core part of this is really thinking about the infrastructure and really ensuring that we have safe and sustainable and reliable infrastructure for all to use. And then lastly, really leading the state with all things around mobility and electrification and thinking about that through policies and programs and pilots and more. A few things that, I'd say we are very excited about. And actually, I just came from an event right before this one. We launched the first of its kind in the United States in a wireless inductive EV charging road. So that literally, I think the ribbon cutting is done now, but it's really exciting to see what this will bring, not only to, and this is in the city of Detroit, but not only the city of Detroit, but the state of Michigan, and also the ripple effect on what this could have across the country, seeing that this is the first of its kind in the United States, and something that we're really proud of. Again, we do a lot of our work through public-private partnerships, and I think John was hitting the nail on the head with that, which is like, again, we have a number of initiatives where we collaborate and provide grant funding for emerging and startup companies that are looking to test technologies or deploy technologies in real world environments, and as well as within a test site. And so we understand that that is so important and so critical for us to think about how we are welcoming innovation and technology, but how we continue to advance this conversation around all things with the future of mobility and electrification. And lastly, I can't forget, this is an exciting time, especially seeing this alignment between a lot of the federal investments that are happening right now within infrastructure and mobility. Just a few to highlight: the CHIPS and Sciences Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law. This is like one of the biggest funding moments we have ever seen. And this is so exciting and something that our state is taking full advantage of and working each and every day to apply for grant and federal grant opportunities and formula funding opportunities, because we know that, one, infrastructure is going to be very important for this transition and journey towards electrification and clean technology. But also we want to continue to focus on our bigger and broader goal, which is decarbonization by 2050. And that is only possible, again, through the investments on the federal side, but also the partnerships that I talked about very early on. So that's just how our office works within the state, but also activating a number of different projects, pilots, and initiatives across the state to really actualize all things around mobility and electrification.
Thanks, Justine. We're definitely going to want to hear a little bit more about that announcement about the wireless inductive charging row a little bit later. But before we get to that, let me turn to Raffi, because you referred to the investment, the grants, the opportunities. Raffi, maybe you can speak to what the federal government, at least in broad strokes, is doing to incentivize greater EV development and adoption.
Yep, I'm happy to. First is our National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure NEVI formula program, which provides $5 billion to the states, primarily through statutory formula to build out national electric vehicle charging networks. And that's an important step towards making EVs, charging accessible to all Americans. However, there's also the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure, CFI, discretionary grant program, which provides $2.5 billion in competitive funding to states, local governments, and tribal governments to deploy EV charging and hydrogen, propane, and natural gas fueling infrastructure along designated alternative fuel corridors and into communities. So I like to say it's the community, they're all community funding, but certainly the CFI one really is trying to insert itself directly into communities. And then lastly, there's the congestion relief program, which provides $250 million in competitive funding to advance innovative multimodal solutions to reduce congestion and related economic and environmental costs in the most congested metropolitan areas of the United States. And certainly, as Justine was underscoring, places like Detroit absolutely are seeing these real life issues right now when it comes not only just to the climate environment, but also the economic and general welfare of communities. And I think that's really the approach this department and government whole approach is about. It's not just about moving people, and all of that is important, but it's also about the quality in which they are moving from to and fro, the lives that they're living, the economic opportunities that are opened up once they're able to get on the road in that EV. And also really looking to the future, especially for the most marginalized in our communities. This government has taken a huge approach towards equity and having meaningful conversations about what equity means, especially in sectors such as transportation and energy, where frankly, those conversations were not necessarily happening over a decade, if not more. And so what's exciting working in government right now, especially at this federal level, is the investment we're seeing in programs and in planning, and that intersectional conversation about equity, about sustainability, about wealth creation for all. And so certainly, we're in our lane, so to speak, here at DOT, and I don't want to misrepresent, for other agencies, but I think we have the directive on high, ultimately coming from the White House and the president around addressing these important issues from that standpoint.
That's a great point, and this overall solution has got to address, it's got to be about rural communities, urban communities, suburban communities, affluent, less affluent, historically marginalized. It really has to take everybody into account, and that's a great point. And Justine, maybe picking up on that, Raffi referred to kind of real life issues, and we know that when it comes to electric vehicles, one of the things people are concerned about is, even if they buy an electric vehicle, is there a charging infrastructure that supports it? Are they going to get stranded because there's nowhere to charge their vehicle? And so as you're obviously right on the ground working on these things day in, day out, how would you assess the current state of the charging infrastructure? What are the critical challenges? How do we get to a point where Americans can feel comfortable that there'll be a sufficient infrastructure to support this transition?
Yeah, great question. And again, something I'm just going to go back to our plan, which outlines a really aggressive goal, where we have a goal of 100,000 chargers by 2030. And these are publicly accessible chargers in the state of Michigan. I say that because it's important, because I think it gets to your point of making sure that the infrastructure is in place, so that we can help with this wide scale and widespread adoption of electric vehicles. Again, as I mentioned before, we have our first wireless inductive charging road that just was put in place. And so that's also exciting, especially on the fleet side, to think about what the opportunities are around static, but also dynamic charging opportunities and technologies and services. So I'd say that's something that's big. I think, of course, when we talk about challenges, again, we have to think about all of the different contexts from rural to urban communities, and thinking about the ways in which vehicles are being utilized to really support that infrastructure that's in place. I think we have to also acknowledge a challenge, which is really around the lack of smart and I say software-driven technologies around all things charging infrastructure. We know that there are many players in the game when we talk about those who are actually charging manufacturers to those who are actually charging operators. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of information that's needed, and coordinating all of those parts and pieces. I also am someone who owns an EV, and so I often think about these experiences when I go to different charging locations that may be different companies, right? And so you have that moment where it's a learning curve every time when you pull up to a charging station, especially if you're not familiar with one. Also, grid reliability is another important conversation that we have to have, and ensuring that our grid has the capacity to support this widespread adoption of EVs. And I think, one thing we have to think about, kind of the curve of which we see energy usage, which is, of course, when we're, in the morning time, you see your spikes within the use of energy, and then you see those lulls, but really thinking about how do we find those moments where it's, we can really think about charging demand that doesn't push everyone to charge at the same time, but really thinking about that demand over the course of a lifetime of the life cycle of a day, but also thinking about those charging needs as well. So I'd say those are some big challenges that we are up against. And I think we're very clear, and we acknowledge that it's not going to be one of those things that we just solve overnight, but I think we are working every single day by putting together an aggressive goal. Again, the 100,000 chargers came from the goal of having 2 million EVs on our roads by 2030. And so in order to do that, we had to think about, making sure that the infrastructure is in place. And we also, I think another thing, just want to acknowledge the cost barriers, right? That EVs right now and historically have been priced at a very high point. And so that point of entry becomes very difficult. But I think we have to continue to monitor that, especially seeing how prices are coming down, but also that secondhand market that might be available for those who are looking to purchase electric vehicles, and making sure that they also feel secure around the charging infrastructure. But I'd say education is key, really exposing people to the charging infrastructure and as well to the electric vehicles altogether is really important. Now, my last point here is, we as a state are also trying our best to also lead the charge by example. And so we're doing that as a part of our state commitment. We have a goal of 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035 for light duty vehicles, and by 2045 for medium and heavy. And so we also are making it's not something that we're just pushing on people and we're not adopting on our own. We also are thinking about this every single day as it relates to our government fleets across the state.
Now, Bill, if I can
Thank
jump
you.
in, I mean, Justine
Yeah,
mentioned
please.
the infrastructure needs, and you're absolutely right. I mean, we have an electric vehicle council that's focused exclusively on infrastructure and how we develop a business environment that supports infrastructure. And the challenge we have right now is the government and a lot of entities are investing a lot of money in infrastructure, and that is extremely critical because there's no money to be made in retail infrastructure. The economics of charging stations is very, very challenging. Certain markets with high demand from the customers, they might be able to pencil out and make a positive return on investment. But without government support at this point, investing in charging infrastructure is a very risky business for a company. One of the problems is, and there's a political fight going on between the retail industry and the utilities. Set that aside. The reality is the utility sector was never designed to support retail transactions like EV charging. So the rate structures are really complicated. And in some cases, in most cases, your retailer who wants to put in a charger is being charged industrial rates with what's called demand charges, which are based upon capacity. But that capacity charge can be really high. And if you don't have enough throughput at your charger, you cannot make money. And so what we've been trying to do, we've got 8 studies already published. We have 2 more in peer review right now. How do we create an environment where government doesn't have to fund all this? That private enterprise sees an economic value, a business reason to install chargers. That's when we're going to get to the 1.5, 2 million, 3 million chargers in the nation that we're going to need. Not all of them have to be these 150 kilowatt chargers. If you think about it, most Americans drive 40 to 50 miles a day. 80% charging happens at home. Once we get to more broad-based EV adoption, apartments and stuff aren't going to have the infrastructure to charge all the vehicles, so we're getting more public charging, but it still doesn't have to be the super fast charging, which costs a ton of money. We can do a lot of level 2. We did a study with S&P Global Mobility that found that 90 to 95% of our charging in public could be level 2, which is fairly reasonable cost if we strategically place where people spend most of their time. And so there's a lot of attention on these DC fast chargers, which are going to be critical for the on-the-go population. But we really need to think about how do we balance our dollars spent? How do we maximize the infrastructure? How do we invest where the customers need it the most? Because we want customers to continue to purchase EVs in growing numbers. We have to move beyond the first movers. And we have to overbuild infrastructure so that families of 4, families of 5 feel confident they will never be stranded. And so until we get to that point, it's going to be tough.
I want to push on that a little bit and also remind our audience, if you have questions, be sure to get them in. We'll get to your questions in a little while. But John, you talk about the infrastructure, the economics associated with it. That's a challenge today. But a lot of people are also focused on the grid itself and whether it's going to be capable of supporting this transition to electric vehicles. And I really ask all of you to, for your thoughts on this, because I know it's a major concern people have. This is, an enormous transition to where a lot of additional burden is going to be placed on the grid. And how do you all feel about what's being done to be able to address that?
And I'll start off in terms of my colleagues, but my first point is I believe the EV transition is actually going to be measured on pace enough for the utility sector to satisfy demand. DOE did a study a couple years ago where generation capacity for the EV transition was not the challenge, it was transmission capacity. Justine mentioned reliability of chargers, that's a big deal. The bigger challenge we've identified recently, we have a workshop with our EV Council in about 2 weeks, is the demand on the grid from artificial intelligence. If you look at adoption curves for AI and the power required for those data centers, you're looking at potentially a 3-fold increase in generating capacity requirement in the next 10 years. The utility sector is not designed to expand that fast. And that dwarfs the demand from EVs. Right? So we have EVs are part of the challenge. Think if it was just EVs, we could satisfy that challenge with the right policy, the right time frame, and the right investment. But we have a lot of other challenges coming on the grid that's going to put some significant pressure on it. I've got tremendous confidence in our utility sector to respond to the challenge given sufficient time. This surge of AI, I don't know if it's going to give them the time. So there is some serious challenge when you already see every year brownouts and blackouts throughout the country. And utilities saying we don't have enough power supply to satisfy demand for this upcoming summer. We have to get in front of this. Otherwise, everything we're trying to do on innovation is going to be impeded by our capacity to support it. So, I mean, I'd love to hear what Raffi and Justine have to say about it. We are very concerned about it. My board is very concerned about it. Our council is very concerned about it. And we're going to do everything we can to help provide as much insight as we can to help guide policymakers and industry to figure out a solution forward. But it's something we can't sweep under the rug.
Yeah, I think just very quickly, and absolutely, I think John raises some significant concerns that the government is aware of. And one of the things to flag certainly is the creation of our new joint office of energy and transportation, which essentially marries, in some respects, the departments of energy and transportation around these conversations. And we know those folks are working very hard to really start these conversations about looking at the demand on the grid and trying to work with the energy sector in understanding tomorrow's demands. One of the things I do want to just highlight in particular around the bipartisan infrastructure law is that it did include tax incentives for purchasing EVs, but we know that we need to make sure that the infrastructure is available and accessible. To Justine's point around that folks can feel comfortable making that transition, but also being very aware about what that demand is ultimately going to do to the energy grid. So I certainly don't want to, again, talk out of place. I don't represent the Department of Energy, so I can't get into energy specific conversation. But what I can say, what gives me hope, and I think ultimately the government hope, is that we understand, again, that we need traditionally siloed sectors starting to talk to one another, starting to really work and address. And I think I'm going to punt it over to Justine in terms of what they're doing there in Michigan regarding, just the local aspect of this, because very much, let's be real, we're being informed by what's happening on the ground in communities like in Michigan.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. And, I'll say two things. One, as part of our Michigan mobility plan, we have a goal of at least 80% of EV charging to take place during off-peak hours. And right now we're at 88%. And again, this is monitoring as folks are transitioning to EVs and how they're charging. So that's going to be something that's really important. But two, I'd say, going to Raffi's point about collaborations, specifically with our utility providers and as well with innovators and as well as companies. We are something that we're really excited about is a project that we have in Michigan called Truck Stop of the Future. And this is a partnership with DTE Energy, which is the energy provider in Southeast Michigan, and with Daimler. And really, I think this is a really exciting time, especially because we're talking about what this might mean for fleets, specifically medium and heavy duty. And I think that's an area that we haven't even tapped into, understanding the impacts on the grid when we talk about medium and heavy duty fleets that are going to be utilizing more energy, right, than what you traditionally look at for a vehicle or light duty vehicles. And so really this space is something that, and this is again through USDOT formula funding that we received for this particular initiative. But I'd say it's something that we're looking forward to learning a lot more and really understanding how the utilities are looking at the medium and heavy duty fleet side, but also, this space is a space that is also going to be important for us to understand the management of energy, the rates associated with those who are going to be utilizing those particular charging resources that will be in place as part of this truck stop of the future. So more to come on that. But, again, I think this is the start and the step in the right direction when we talk about these types of collaborations and partnerships. And again, I think a very important part of our office is just that, it's collaborating, really removing those silos and talking to the folks at DT, talking to the folks at Michigan Department of Transportation. This is really that time where we have to really work together like no other to really make sure that, one, we have a resource that is sustainable, that it is reliable, but also we're going to be learning a lot. And I think as we learn a lot, we have to iterate and take those lessons, and whether those are challenging lessons that we have to learn to really think about improving this overall. So that's something I'm really looking forward to and excited that we actually have funding in place so that we can do some of this work on the ground.
Justine, that's a great point. Sorry, Bill. The idea, what I hear a lot is we come up with the initial plan for a nascent industry. And when that plan doesn't meet the milestones, the detractors go, oh, see, you guys are so wrong. There's no way this is going to work. This is a very young industry. We are just starting. Less than 1.5% of vehicles on the road have a plug. And we've got a long way to go. And as long as we stay nimble and keep our eye on the ball, we're trying to reduce carbon. EVs are a huge tool in that arsenal. But the goal is reduce carbon emissions while reducing criteria pollutant emissions, while preserving access to affordable, reliable transportation. It's all in there. But that's going to require adjustments in the plan and changes and different objectives being shifted left and right based on reality. And I think that's something that we need to be very honest about and set expectations that, look, here's the plan. This is not going to be a straight line trajectory. This is going to be all over the place. If we stay committed in a public-private partnership, in a collaborative environment, we can reach the goal. But those who are on the outside cheering for these efforts to fail are going to jump on any news story that shows, see, the straight line didn't work. If we're more honest about it and say, look, we know this is going to be bumpy, it's going to be messy, but we're committed to getting to our ultimate objective, then I think we can bring more people along with us. But it really comes down to, your question, Bill, gets into some of the naysayers I hear a lot is, but what about this? What about that? And they're just trying to find chinks in the armor. There is no armor plating around this. This needs to be a collaborative effort to reduce emissions, improve the environment, improve our transportation system. And if we stay committed to that, we can achieve some incredible things.
Yeah, it's a great point about partnerships, the need to kind of have an all hands on deck. And Justine, I'm just curious whether you all interact significantly with what other states are doing, how you work with local governments within Michigan. Obviously, the rural sector is a different challenge than the urban sector. California, for example, is a leader, and they're doing a lot with electric vehicles, other states as well. How much is that a part of your approach to kind of share best practices and benefit, as John kind of alluded to the learnings and take advantage of what's happening around the country?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'd say we work with everyone. That's including local governments all across the state. I think we understand that, one, there is a big challenge when it comes to transitioning folks to not only jobs of the future, especially when we talk about mobility, when we talk about electrification, different needs, right? And we think about those various skill sets. We have to work with academic partners on a regular basis so that we are preparing residents. Again, no city in favor here. It's everywhere across the state of Michigan. We need to make sure all residents are prepared to transition. And we have to make sure that our academic institutions, community colleges are ready for many of those changes and shifts that are going to happen. I would say, in terms of even collaborating, we have a partnership with National Park Services. And, one of the amazing and unique things with Michigan is that we have this abundance of fresh water and as well as lots of outdoor spaces. And so we have a partnership with the National Park Service for something we call National Park Service Mobility Challenge. And essentially, we are thinking about all things with electrification of outdoor recreational vehicles, outdoor recreational spaces, so that we can connect people to these locations. We provide grant funding for companies that are looking to do work around the outdoor recreational space as well. So, we are regularly in talks with folks who are looking to find ways to have their new technologies and innovations in place that can support anything from snowmobiles all the way to heavy duty charging, as I mentioned before, medium and heavy duty charging, especially with that partnership with Daimler and DTE, with Truck Stop of the Future. We also have something called the Fresh Coast Maritime Challenge, which essentially we have the first EV vessel charging station in the country in Elk Rapids. And essentially this is to support recreational boating on the water utilizing electric vessels. And so we have to think about this all again, not just only with our heads down with one particular city. We really have to tap on everyone because everyone has a different component to fill when we talk about this goal around electrification. We also have something called Lake Michigan Circuit, which is a partnership that we have with the state of Michigan, Illinois. There's a number of different states that are involved around the Lake Michigan perimeter. And really that is to provide charging stations around Lake Michigan. And so, these types of collaborations, again, if someone's driving from, Ohio, they should still be able to, or driving from Illinois, they should still be able to continue to have access to charging stations. It shouldn't feel choppy. It should feel very seamless. And so as part of that, we really thought it was very important that we formed this alliance with many of those around the Great Lakes, so that we can continue to talk about EV charging infrastructure that needs to be in place to support someone who is transitioning from one state to the next. So that work is very important to a lot of the things that we are doing. And, I'd say, I can't stress how much collaboration that we in our office does in particular. I think we're unique because we have a separate, arm where we can provide funding for new innovations and technologies. And we're not afraid to make those investments, right? We're not afraid to say, let's take that chance, let's take that risk, because at the end of the day, we need to learn very quickly and we need to iterate over and over again. So we really can think about how we're future-proofing our roadways and our streets, and really making sure that people can move around, whether that is in their personal vehicle or as well as public transportation. All of that is very important. So
yeah, I mean, that's fantastic, because it really underscores that how this has to be an all hands on deck. Every piece of the puzzle has to be part of this. We're going to turn to questions from the audience in just a minute or two, but I did want to ask John, Raffi, your thoughts about one critical piece of the electric vehicle ecosystem, which is the supply chain, the battery minerals that are involved, our reliance on critical minerals. Mining is such an issue. How do you see that? Where are we with it? Is there a recycling element that allows us to reuse these components so that we're not simply digging further? What are the equity and justice issues as we think about, various communities that can be affected by having to mine for these things? So just if you could address that for a couple of minutes. I know it's such a critical part of this picture.
John, you want, okay. So I think certainly number one, the federal government absolutely understands that there are environmental concerns, and that we need to take them, seriously. In particular, recycling lithium ion batteries is an important way to address sustainability concerns in their production. It is understood about today only 5% of used batteries are recycled in general in the United States. So more efficient and safer recycling methods, can address those. And we know that Again, there are folks out there that are coming up with those best practices, and we really need to just scale that up in terms of the public's knowledge about how best to recycle. And in addressing the in-demand materials themselves is also an option. Many manufacturers have been able to dramatically reduce their cobalt consumption by substituting with iron and magnesium. And iron and magnesium are more abundant options, and their extraction can be done in the US with safer and more sustainable methods. Of course, again, I'm Department of Transportation, not energy, but we know those conversations and best practices are being developed, and really we need to make sure that we don't lose our eye on the impact. When it comes to supply chain in particular, the government passed policies through, in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act, directly to incentivize American mineral supply chains or countries with closer trade relations to have that conversation about how to do this more sustainably and equitably. We know there are concerns out there. I don't represent international trade here, but we definitely know that conversations need to be held about those concerns. And certainly, again, just want to underscore the importance of the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. They're leading in those conversations, with our departments about those very concerns. But I definitely want to turn it on to John as an expert too, to weigh in here.
I think, I mentioned the red herrings and the naysayers looking for any chink in the armor. My team does 40 to 50 presentations a year, and we always get a question about, well, we're going to these batteries. These batteries have some really nasty stuff in them. What are we doing about that? And we've seen the memes of kids mining for cobalt overseas, and we've seen the images of just negative connotations. I'm going to stress again, we are still in the very early stages of this industry. If you look back to the beginning of the automotive industry, the first fuels and engines weren't the best. We've come a long way. And I think even in the last 10 years, we've come a long way with the chemistry composition of our batteries. And I think the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see significant improvements, not only in the performance of the batteries, but in the environmental impact of those batteries. And I think it's absolutely essential. I've been in this industry a long time. I've seen the environmental community get behind technology and solutions. Once those technology and solutions start gaining traction, they find a reason to attack them. We've seen it already. We've seen some environmental organizations start attacking the batteries. You have to have energy, whether it's the electric energy or liquid energy or something. We need to have energy. For everything we're talking about requires energy. Transitioning to the cleanest form of energy is the goal. And batteries are charged by the grid. We have to clean the grid. We have to make sure all these things are working together. And all of these challenges that are raised, there are really smart people working on solutions. And I'm highly optimistic that over time, we're going to have a battery that's going to give us 300 or 500 mile range, recharge in 10 minutes, and be much more environmentally sensitive than the batteries you're using today. There's just way too much money being invested in battery research and development to not expect that. The other side of the coin you raised was the whole equity issue. And we have to make sure that this energy transition, be it electric vehicles or what have you, has to address all communities, all people, and give them all the opportunity to benefit and thrive under the new ecosystem that we're creating. Otherwise, we're going to trap people where they are, and that's not okay. We have to make sure that everybody retains access to affordable, reliable transportation, has access to clean air. If you look at some of the most polluted communities in the country, they're usually the lowest income, and their driving vehicles are 25 years old. If we could figure out a way to help them get vehicles only 10 years old, we'll reduce emissions dramatically, improve their economics, improve their life. Globally, we've got billions of people that don't have access to indoor plumbing. Billions don't have access to indoor electricity. We have to have a global perspective on making sure that all of those needs are participating and benefiting from this energy transition. If we don't pay attention to the needs of people, one of the sound bites I use, I'm not a politician, but every once in a while I like to use sound bites. If we're going to protect the environment, but disregard the people, what are we doing? So we have to make sure that we're thinking about the needs of the people as well as the needs of the environment. And if we do that, we can. They're not mutually exclusive. we can have better batteries, we can have better fuel, we can have better vehicles and better air, and can have more affordable transportation options. But if we don't pay attention to all of it at the same time, we're going to miss something. So I'm glad that, I love seeing what Justine and Raffi are doing in their departments and their teams. We need everybody to be thinking this way, thinking broadly, thinking about innovation and options to make sure we succeed in what our objectives are.
Thanks, John. Let's turn to some questions from our audience.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been a very stimulating conversation here. We've received over 50 questions, so we'll get through as many as possible here. First one up is bidirectional charging is a commercially available and viable technology offering a compelling energy value proposition that should accelerate EV adoption. How prominent is this technology in short and long-term planning? How can this synergy be incorporated into energy planning for low-income communities?
John, you want to?
Jump on in.
I'm just going to say, who wants to take the first swing at this? I'm sure we all have an opinion. Raffi, I'm assuming your department has talked about this a lot.
Yeah, we're in conversations, and definitely, I actually be very curious, from Justine's end around from a local perspective, around addressing this. I think my answer is yes, everything above and scaling up, because we know we have to tackle this from a variety of different vantage points, but to just underscore again, thinking about the most impacted, the most vulnerable communities that are there. Are we addressing, these issues from a strategy that is ultimately going to enrich their lives and not keep them out? And so I'm curious, Justine, from your angle around that equity aspect on addressing that, what you're seeing in Michigan.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I often tell folks, I think redundancy is very important when we talk about all things around electrification and technology that supports redundancy. I would say, yes, bidirectional charging is important, and so is just having access to a charging station to begin with, right? Like there may not even be, I think about not only just like those who live in multi-unit dwellings, those who live in rural communities, do they have the vehicle? Can they get access to the charging? I think these are like question one. And how do we continue to support our grid, right? And so I think that could be bidirectional charging. As I mentioned, I just came from an event that could be a wireless inductive road that doesn't even need an actual piece of infrastructure to plug into, but maybe there is, again, when we think about, for me, the exciting part about hearing it and being here with this wireless roadway is that I think about it from level of how do we take a fleet or mass transit bus to really provide that service for people to still move, whether they own a vehicle or not. And I think we have to be mindful that that car ownership may not be something that is easy for everyone to have. And we still should care about how people are getting from point A to point B. And so when I think about a lot of these investments in infrastructure and technology around bidirectional charging, I think it is very important. I think it should be utilized, across whether that's urban, rural, and thinking about vulnerable communities. But I'd also say we should continue to explore more technologies that also bring large groups of people, whether that is by bus, whether that is by micro transit vehicles, especially I think about migrant workers or people who may not have, having ownership of a car may not work, but maybe there's the carpooling model that works. How do we continue to support folks in that fashion to really provide equitable services for all? So I think the technology is great, and I say, yes, we should do it, but also we should also continue to invest in more to support people moving accordingly.
I agree that the bidirectional charging is a great opportunity. And I think technologically it can be done. We know how to do it. There is a challenge. Are the utilities willing to participate and accept the redelivery of electrons to the grid? There was an issue with that years ago when solar became real popular. Is could you net meter your house? Just seeing your comment about, I think 88% of your charging is done in off-peak hours. That is such an opportunity. Most personal vehicles are only driven 5% of the time or less. They're stationary 95% of the time. If we can create an infrastructure and a culture by which consumers are comfortable charging overnight when the peak demand is low, and allowing their vehicle to be distributed energy storage to resupply the grid during peak time, that's going to be a huge opportunity. It's going to address your question, Bill, about the grid. Can it support what we're doing? We need distributed energy storage in order to make this whole thing work. The problem I believe we run into is we still have range anxiety with a lot of people about EVs. And let's be honest, most consumers don't share. The HOV carpool has not been successful. And once I charge my phone, you want to borrow my charge? I don't think so. So we need to create a culture where we become comfortable with our driving patterns and the range of our vehicles before the consumer is going to be willing to say, yes, I will sell back some of the charge I painstakingly, in their mind, painstakingly inserted in my vehicle. That's going to take a lot of time, but we should not discount the opportunity that bidirectional charging presents to us. And if we can find a way to crack that nut, it could be a huge benefit to the overall resiliency of the grid.
Certainly. I appreciate the feedback from everyone on that question. We've also received a lot of questions surrounding the cost of EVs. So how do we address the knock-on effect of expensive EVs on Americans who predominantly purchase used vehicles?
I can kick this off with, we have to communicate the cost savings from fuel and from maintenance costs that will be substantially lower in an EV, while also working, to mitigate the inaccessible, sticker prices. And so I think one of the things that's very exciting is the fact that when it comes to the OEMs, and I know, Justine, this being out there in Michigan, is that, we're dealing with market reality too around supply and demand. I think the OEMs very much understand that the curve has turned and that the future is coming. And as we know, with just the basics of economics is around, how the consumer is going to be behaving when it comes to the prices, and the laws of competition absolutely, are going to be applied here. So I think, from Department of Transportation's end, we have to be, sort of in our lane again around we're not there around putting out any rule around pricing, et cetera, but in terms of just watching the market force, do its thing, it is clear that consumers are going to literally drive where they're going to feel that they're going to have the most savings. But we can incentivize, again, around these cost savings, around tax incentives, et cetera, that I think will really, push the consumer behavior. And so that is certainly top of mind approach from our department.
I think most of the OEMs producing EVs are losing money on every unit they sell. That's not sustainable, and they're still expensive vehicles that tax credits help with or tax incentives help with. But I think it's an evidence. This is a piece of evidence that shows that we need more solutions for those consumers who cannot afford a electric vehicle. We need to have low carbon fuel options for their vehicles. We need to provide them hybrids with low carbon fuel options. We need to provide solutions that fit every economic strata of the economy. Eventually, EVs will become cost competitive and cost advantageous on surface, eventually. But they also have to turn a profit for the OEMs if they're going to stay in production. Regardless of claims and pledges, if it's not making money, these publicly traded companies will stop producing them. They have to have a choice. And so we need to find a way to make them more economical on the surface. But until they are, how are we going to provide those lower emissions options at lower cost to more consumers? And that's why all of the above strategy is so critical. We need multiple solutions. We can't put all of our eggs in one basket.
And lastly, I'll just jump really quickly because I know that we are at time, but I'll say two things. Purchase incentives are something that the state of Michigan provides. I know a number of different states are also looking at that or have utilized purchase incentives for those who are looking at purchasing EVs. The other thing I'll just mention, and I'll just do a shout out for a Michigan-based company called OurEnergyPolicy.org, which is the first, EV. It is establishing the first cell and EV battery pack in Michigan. And so this is something that we're really excited about. They actually have done a charge, I think, on charging their battery, I think over 600 miles on one charge. And so as we think about technologies that are continuing to evolve, and I always use the analogy, once upon a time, flat screen TVs were extremely expensive. Over time, the technology has gotten smarter and smarter, and flat screen TVs have gotten thinner and thinner and thinner, and the prices have come down. And so as we continue to look at technologies that are continuing to evolve over time. And again, thinking about, I think, John, you were talking about the battery life cycle, and seeing how batteries are changing and evolving every single day. I think the price point will also become something that is more affordable for folks.
So I hate to jump in here with this message, because we could obviously continue this conversation for another couple of hours, given the importance of the issue and the knowledge that you all have been so gracious in sharing with our audience. But thank you so much. We are at the end of the hour. And so I want to thank John, Justine, Raffi for taking the time to share your insights. I want to thank our audience for joining us, and also point out that if you have colleagues who couldn't make it, we will be posting the recording of this on the Our Energy Policy website. Access the Our Energy Library, which has additional materials on this topic. And most importantly, I know there were a lot of questions we couldn't get to, but if you do want to send them in to Our Energy Policy, we'll do our best to see if our panelists may have a moment or two to see if they can respond to a question that we couldn't get to this hour, because we know the extreme interest that everyone had in this topic. And of course, I want to thank our supporters and partners, because that's essential to the work we do. Thank you again for your support. And so finally, just thanks to everyone who has participated in this. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And Justine, John, Raffi, thanks, and wish you a great rest of the week, and same to everyone out there. Thank you very much.